Howdy all. Today we are going to talk about Theophrastus Philippus Aureolus Bombastus von Hohenheim, okay, better known as Paracelsus. Okay. Um, he's from Zurich, near Zurich, Einsiedeln, so he's a Swiss scientist. His dates I seem to have forgotten. They're somewhere around 1482 to 1546. Um, and in any case, Paracelsus, this figure, in my mind, constitutes the last of the major nails in the coffin of Orthodox Galenism and why humoral physiology falls apart, um, along with the new botany, along with Vesalian anatomy. This one really does offer a rival system. Sometimes Paracelsus is hailed as the father of modern chemical pharmacy, which I'm going to see whether that's true. He's also sometimes condemned as a religious fanatic, as a mystic, as a magician, as a showman, as a quack. Um, I would say, honestly, he's all of these things put into one, which makes him a very enigmatic figure in the history of medicine. And certainly, we can't just pronounce something like this without making lots of qualifications, without defining exactly what it was he did and why he started this entirely new trend in the history of medicine. He's probably the most difficult figure in this entire course to make sense of, because on the one hand, he seems to believe in everything which we today would consider backward and superstitious um, and crazy. Things like astrology, the hermetic magic we discussed, the role of supernatural divine forces in medicine. He believes in all those things, oddly enough. On the other hand, he also believes in direct observation in favor of the ancient authorities. He believes in empirical trial and error with chemically concentrated drugs, and I'll explain how that it comes to pass. And he also thinks of diseases, as localized entities, which is a really modern phenomenon, not something that has to do with imbalance in your body, but something that actually attacks an individual organ or part of your body. Um, that's an entirely new way of thinking of things. I think almost every system we've talked about thus far considers disease to be the result of an imbalance of some kind. So, in a weird way, Paracelsus is totally looking backward in terms of the addition of magic and religion, but he also looks very much forward at the same time. And in hindsight, at least from our perspective, he seems to be completely paradoxical, right? How can someone point the way toward the future and yet still include all these supposedly irrational, non-scientific elements in medicine? That seems to be a contradiction in terms. Well, that's the answer. That's what I'm going to try and address today, is how that could be. And the problem, strangely enough, I'm going to insist, is not really in any inconsistency in Paracelsus's thought. It's not at all. In fact, exactly the opposite. He's a very consistent writer. It's our problem. It's because we're looking at him through very 20th century eyes, and we're assuming that there's a very straight path that leads to us, and we have the truth. And we may not know everything today, but here are these landmarks that tell us the way to the future, and they all point forward. But that's not how history works. It's not how scientific advancement works. It's not how the path of things that we assume are magic and superstitious perversely sometimes lead to the present. That is a paradox, I know, but history really doesn't work in a progressive path. It's not positivist, if you remember that word I introduced at the beginning of the course. The tendency of modern people is we put science in one box that answers how everything works. We put religion in another box that explains why it works, and most of us toss magic out the window. We think it's nonsense, right? That's not how the 16th century mind works. They're all in the same box, weirdly enough. And even I would say when we'll get to the scientific revolution, when we get to the so-called 17th century, the ways that really points toward the present, we'll see these people still have it in the same box. We'll see people like Isaac Newton write books about angels. It's just, it doesn't lead, you know, their minds don't work the way ours do. That's just the only way to say it. And much as it might surprise you, Paracelsus, religion, magic, science, these are all interconnected ways of thinking about the whole cosmos. You know, the many leading figures of the scientific revolution thought that way. Not just Newton, Kepler also. The guy who wrote the books, the Three Laws of Planetary Motion, was a mystic. You know, so I want to stress this very strongly, is that there is not a logical inconsistency in their minds in believing in supernatural forces and thinking of rational medicine. 16th and 17th century, in a way, what is interesting, Hippocrates and Galen, they're separate, right? They're totally separate. They are to us also, but early modern Europe, they're still very, very much connected, and that connection, strangely enough, leads to progress. Okay, so let's talk about the guy. So his family name is Bombastus. That sounds like like, you know, to be inflated with your own importance and go on and be. But actually, that's not where the word comes from. It comes from bombix, which means a silkworm, and the word bombast is silk padding that you put in a coat or something. So the I don't know where that modern word to be bombastic comes from, but his that's his family name, Bombastus. But it certainly does describe his personality. We'll see, interestingly enough. But how about the name Paracelsus? So this is a weird, there's argument over this too. It seems to be beyond Celsus, or Celsus, as we've been pronouncing it the proper Latin way. That doesn't really make any sense, because Celsus, you know, was newly discovered in the Renaissance, if you remember. But why would he be beyond him? He's totally trashing him. He's better than him, but like, why wouldn't he be beyond Galen then, or beyond Hippocrates or someone? Why pick a minor Roman figure? That seems really kind of weird. So he's certainly not the foremost authority. So I think Paracelsus is an odd Latin translation of Hohenheim, which is the place he's from. And that name was taken in 1529. So, you know, as all people did back then, they adopted Latin names, and I think that's what Paracelsus means. It's not beyond Celsus. But in any case, Paracelsus was born in Switzerland. He studied briefly medicine, mineralogy, mining, all sorts of odd things, natural philosophy that would not be part of a regular medical training. He studied at a point with various bishops. He studied with the abbot of Sponheim, who's Johannes Trithemius, who is a magus, a magician. Okay, the magus is the Latin word for magician, who believed in these unseen occult forces in the universe, and one who believed he could tap into the secrets of the world and achieve universal knowledge. If you think back to the Renaissance, when all this magical stuff was getting really in, Trithemius is one of these magicians of the Renaissance, okay, the way to put it. And there is, strangely, this very long and oddly respectable tradition of magic in medicine. That's especially in educated circles. I know this sounds contradictory, but especially among a group of thinkers in the late Renaissance who were Neoplatonists, especially the Florentine figure Marsilio Ficino, who was a physician, actually, in the late 15th century in Florence, who believed that astrology and occult forces and things that are unseen could be used to affect health, could be used to cure people. And of course, he's not thinking of black magic. He's not thinking of the, you know, arcana that's demonic. He's thinking of just using astral forces in nature. And really, there's no association with this kind of white magic, let's call it. There's no association with the devil or anything. It's actually very respectable. And I think it just, these were things that they believed worked without visible causes. Things like miracles, um, things that were, strangely enough, I know this is going to sound odd, but to this generation of people, there is no logical inconsistency with believing in astral forces and unseen occult powers. There's no inconsistency of that with Christianity. Um, that doesn't seem to make sense to us, but Ficino wrote, strangely, a Platonic theology. Plato and Jesus were saying basically the same thing, is what he's saying. And Moses, and Hermes Trismegistus, and all of these other arcane magical writers. So in other words, he is a, what we would call a syncretist, okay, meaning sin, meaning together, putting all these things that are from different traditions together, and arguing that religion, magic, astrology, alchemy, Hebrew Kabbalism, numerology, prophecy, those are all just different ways of finding out divine truth that is universal, that is the same. They're just different forms of it. And of course, he's still a Christian and still believes these things. This is, I should mention, the last time in history these things can all be put in one box. After the Reformation, which we'll get to in a moment, those things become forbidden and heretical. Okay, but in the 15th century, they're still, oh, it's okay to mix all these things. They're just different ways of seeing the truth, different ways of understanding the connection of the microcosm to the macrocosm. Now note, something very important about this kind of syncretic theology of magic is that it does not go on in universities. Okay, what's happening in universities is mostly Aristotelian. And what I think is also important about Paracelsus, to get back to him, is that I don't think he ever got a university degree. I think he went there and he dabbled in it and he tried it and he just found it really distasteful. And as we'll see, he was generally very hostile about what was taught in the medical faculties of the universities. He's and he knows a bit of Latin. He's a really pretty bad Latinist, but most of what he wrote was in German, common, intentionally so, written in very common working class kind of German, and that's very important because Paracelsus is an anti-intellectual. Okay, the way you find truth is not through books, not through university training, not through any kind of formal education. It's a very different thing. It's a mystical thing. Okay, now to make sense of this, which I think probably should be completely incomprehensible to you up until this point, is that Paracelsus was a sort of a grassroots radical reformer. Anti-establishment in many, many ways, but I think the way that really informs his approach to medicine, we can't begin to understand unless I explain what happens in the Reformation. Okay, so let me digress just for a moment. I know this is going to seem like a left turn in the topic, but it's kind of, I don't think you can make any sense of Paracelsus unless you kind of understand where he's coming from, by looking at his radical roots. Okay, now what do I mean by that word radical? We use the term in a very slipshod kind of way, meaning anything that's extreme. That's not what the word means at all. Radical comes from the word radix, which means root in Latin. So the word radix, radish, it also means root in Latin. But radical means to go back to the origins, to the roots of something. To be radical means you're getting rid of everything. That's why it seems extreme, but by returning to the original foundations without all the accretions of history and change. So radical, when I say radical, in this context, I'm talking about the Reformation, returning Christianity to its original roots before all those changes that were introduced in, the cults of saints, the ecclesiastical hierarchy, the church, the bishops, the popes, all that stuff, all the inequality, all the monasteries, all this stuff, which was never, of course, mentioned by Jesus. There's a movement within the Reformation to return back to the original roots. Now let me step back and sort of explain what I'm talking about here. Paracelsus was a first-hand witness to the Protestant Reformation. In a nutshell, what that Reformation was an attempt by figures such as Martin Luther, to start with, in Germany, to reform the theology of the Catholic Church in a way that de-emphasized the rituals of the Mass, especially of the sacraments, which were really at the center of medieval Catholic worship, um, and the Latin Mass, which of course no one understood anymore. Latin's not a spoken language unless you're in a university. Um, and instead of stressing those things which were considered works, good deeds, works which will get you into heaven, in a sense, I like to describe the way medieval people thought about salvation was that they imagined God sort of had a big book of good works, and every time you did something good, you went on a pilgrimage, you prayed to a saint. Remember those healing saints? You give money to the church, whatever it may be. You get a check mark, a brownie point, I don't know, whatever it may be. And once you get a certain number of brownie points, you get into heaven, right? It's simple as that. You earn your salvation by doing good works and good deeds and helping people too, and being a moral person, of course, all those things that will get you salvation. Now, Luther looked at this, and coming from a really profound spiritual crisis, because he tried to be a monk and he failed really miserably, and he kept wondering, oh my God, how do I keep messing up. I can't fast. I can't go without sleep like all these guys. I can't punish my body. Remember back to when we talked about monasticism? He's trying to do that stuff and really failing. And he had this crisis where he says, well, how do I know when I've done enough stuff to make God happy to get me salvation? And he said, I can't know. It's really bugging me. And he happened to have been reading in Paul, who was, you remember, sort of invented Christianity. And there's places where Paul says the works don't matter. It's faith that really gets you saved. If you believe in him, you can mess up a million times, but if you really believe, you will still be saved. And all you really need is faith. The works will come spontaneously and easily once you have the faith, but they're not what counts. And the logic of this is you can't really coerce God into giving you salvation, right? You can't do all sorts of things and go bing, and there's the right number of points, and then you're in heaven. It doesn't work that way. What God really wants is faith. And Paul says this, and Luther looks at it and he says, really? I don't have to do all this stuff? Because I'm finding it really hard. All I need to do is have faith, and then all this stuff will become easy. And so what he says is the doctrine of justification by faith alone, sola fide, which in Latin, which means that you only people who are going to get saved are those who believe, because otherwise you could be a non-believer, be a rotten person in fact, and just do lots of good deeds, give lots of money. You could buy your salvation, right? And in fact, the thing that kind of triggers this, and I won't go too much into this, so don't worry, is that there's this guy Tetzel selling these indulgences. Basically, it's a piece of paper that says the purchaser of this document will get time out of purgatory and go to heaven, which means that if you're really rich, you can buy your way into heaven. That's the implication. Now, people argue about what those really meant, but I think in common people's minds, they thought, I give money, I get out of purgatory, I go to heaven, great. And all that money, incidentally, went to building St. Peter's. So whether it was worth it, I don't know. Think about that. I argue maybe it was worth it. I don't know. But in any case, Luther wrote, his 95 Theses, tacked them up to the church door in Wittenberg, and started a major controversy. Eventually, the Pope said, "You get down here and answer these accusations." Leo X, and the Elector of Saxony, was the ruler of this part of Germany where all this happened, said, no, I'm holding Luther. I'm going to protect him. And that's what really causes the schism that breaks Christianity into many parts, many different sects within the Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church really only begins right then. Everyone's Christian before. And then we have all sorts of various other Christian denominations, right? Lutheran, Calvinist, Methodist, way down the road, all sorts of other denominations. Now, another part of this whole effort was the reformers said, look, if we're going to reform the church, let's go back to the Bible and look at what it really says, because it doesn't mention a big wealthy church and a powerful pope and all this other stuff, and certainly not indulgences, all this other stuff that has all these accretions of history over the past 1,500 years are not in the text. We're not really following what Jesus himself said, right? And the most important thing, they said, well, Jesus was poor, and the apostles didn't have money. They were very simple. They went around begging. We should do that too. So the idea is the authority becomes the text of the Bible itself. Sola scriptura is the doctrine. If you're going to reform stuff, go by the book only. Um, and without lingering on the details of what happens here, the German states break away. The Switzerland has its own reform movement and breaks away under Ulrich Zwingli. The Scandinavian states break away because of they become Lutheran also. England breaks away with its own very interesting, odd Reformation. So, very importantly, the Reformed churches are put in place by states, by actual governments, right? They're temporal governments that carry out these reformations. Now, what does all this have to do with Paracelsus, you're now wondering? Beneath all these official reformations that happen throughout Europe, there's also what's called the magisterial reformations. There's also a groundswell of popular sentiment that is more radical, that says, well, you may have reformed, but you're still doing a lot of stuff that's not in the Bible. Lutherans, for example, still had bishops, and they still had physical churches, and they were still wealthy. There were things they believed that Luther and the other reformers just hadn't gone far enough, and they really weren't looking very close at the Bible itself and the message of Jesus himself. Things like the poverty of the church, the fact that there weren't any physical buildings, or there wasn't certainly not a church government at that point. And then there were other things like, if you were to slap Jesus across the face, what did he say to do? Not hit back. He said, turn the other cheek, right? Except, he was a pacifist. Thou shalt not kill should be taken literally. Not when you feel like killing someone, or when your state orders you to do so, or when you're a criminal, you do execute those people. It's not in the text. So a group of people, let's use the term that was used at the time. It's a term of abuse, actually, but they're called Anabaptists. And the word comes from the fact that they looked at the Bible and said, there's no place in here where infants are baptized. Everyone who's baptized was an adult, and they do it as a willing entrance into the church. And remember, Jesus himself was an adult, and John the Baptist poured water over him, and he accepted that he was then reborn, right? So these people baptize themselves. Anna means again. So their detractors called them rebaptizers, because they were all, of course, baptized at birth, but now they're doing it again to signal that they're going back to the original church. Now, so these Anabaptists, you might not be familiar with that word, but you are probably familiar with their descendants. The actual literal descendants of these people are the Amish today in Pennsylvania. They're the Mennonites. They're the Schwenkfelders. They're the Hutterites who are in North and South Dakota. So interestingly enough, they survive in America. And just by coincidence, if you look right over my head, that hat, that's actually an Amish hat up there. I got it in Pennsylvania years and years ago. So these Anabaptists were mercilessly persecuted. They kept running. Many of them thought the apocalypse was about to happen, and a second coming of Christ and a new Jerusalem and all the stuff that's in the book of Revelations. And there was also a group among them, part of this unofficial grassroots radical reformation, that are called Spiritualists. And that term doesn't mean that they're, playing with the Ouija board and contacting the dead. It means that they believe that alongside the Bible, the book itself, which was written by people, individuals can actually get infused with the Spirit directly and have this mystical understanding of divine truths without any knowledge of Christianity even. Little like the syncretists, right? Is that you can have divine truth without the Bible. Now that's a step way beyond anything that any of these other reformers would do, is that a person can, there's no priesthood, anyone can just stand up and start talking and have this divine truth. One guy, one particular, Kaspar Schwenkfeld, directly influenced Paracelsus. That's why I'm mentioning this spiritualist movement. And I should mention the Schwenkfelders exist only in, I think, 2 congregations on earth in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. That's the only place they still exist. Paracelsus never really belonged to that group or to or to any church, in fact. But his ideas are so close to theirs, and in many ways he's certainly influenced by them. But that's his intellectual roots. Okay? Now, what does this have to do with medicine? Again, you're still asking. When Paracelsus does his research, he looks at things, but he also has a kind of mystical understanding of the properties of a given chemical through direct revelation. God gives him this information. He observes something. So he's not approaching it like a scientist would, who's going to measure the mass and the volume and do a clinical trial, anything like that. He kind of, the word is actually really fascinating. In German, it's ablauschen, to overhear. You look at something and you overhear by mystical process what this is going to cure. That's his research. Okay, and it's like the mystical revelation that a radical reformer would have. Like the reformers, Paracelsus was also socially radical. Now, what do I mean by that? Is that the common people should run the church, not wealthy authorities and monasteries and bishops and all that. And to find out remedies, he said, don't trust university physicians, don't trust those people who are trained in schools with their big, fat, massive Latin tomes. They are elitist, they charge a fortune, they're astronomical fees. Aristotle is nonsense, that way of arguing, that whole logic is nonsense. Instead, go to the poor, ignorant people. Find out what they're doing. You're gonna discover they know how to cure. And in fact, weirdly enough, this is another strange thing, a strange theological point, I guess I want to make, is that the salvation for the radical reformers is universal. Anyone with faith will get it. It's not just elite people, which seems to be what Calvinism was suggesting. So it's really kind of democratic, right? It means anyone can be saved, anyone can find mystical truths and overhear what medicines are good, or will cure you. So it's really very, how should I say, populist in a way that the religion and the medicine, and this is a medicine for poor people also. And I think the one historian of Paracelsus said that this is the first time a medical system is completely integrated into Christianity. And I think that's true, actually, because of course Christ was a faith healer, remember, right? This is the first time that it's not performing miracles, that's actually not what they're doing at all, but they're doing something that's kind of akin to a mystical medical practice that's informed by this radical religion. Okay, now having said that, you could imagine that Paracelsus doesn't want anything to do with universities. He traveled around a lot. He actually went to Ferraro, and he met some of the foremost medical humanists. Think back to last Wednesday when we were talking about them. People like Monardus and Leoniceno. He had terrible things to say about them afterwards. These guys are idiots. All they care about is books and not actual healing people. But he did get a job, which is surprising. So he eventually he becomes a town physician. Remember those municipal physicians that cities would hire? He becomes one for the city of Basel in 1527. And he did something really weird. He told people, gather in the town courtyard. It happened on June 24th, 1527. And he took Avicenna's Canon, the big fat book, and actually I have it on my shelf. Maybe I should grab it. You just imagine I'm holding this big book, and he burns it publicly and says, this is what Avicenna deserves, this nonsense. So is he a showman? Yes, absolutely. Sometimes it's claimed that he burned Galen, but it might as well have been Galen, right? It's the same stock of information. And he of course attacked Galen no less violently. But this is a weird thing to do for a guy who's obviously going to get himself in trouble with the authorities, not just on the basis of his religion, but on the basis of his stance toward medical authority in general, right? This is so the how do you suppose the universities are going to deal with this upstart showman? Well, of course, they hated him. They ran him out of town. They heard that this was done, and they forced Basil to kick him out. And that's pretty much the story of the rest of his life. He spends it running from places, making enemies, making everyone hate him. He was really an obnoxious figure by every account. Arrogant, conceited, but really why he was so hated is he's threatening the medical establishment. If he's telling poor people, you know what, I have medicines, don't go to those quacks, those Latin-speaking idiots, because they don't know anything. Their medicine is a few thousand years old. I've got medicines that are going to cure, chemicals that are much stronger, that will cure you of anything. So really, he's threatening their monopoly of practice. That's the important point. And people who attacked him. Operinus, do you remember I mentioned him a couple of lectures back? Anyway, he's an Orthodox Galenist and attacks him in print and says, Paracelsus is a drunkard and a madman. And Operinus, kind of establishes poor Paracelsus's reputation of being a quack. So he keeps getting kicked out of every place he goes. He went to St. Gallen, he went to Augsburg, he went to Salzburg, really kind of meeting these are all places where there are radical reformers also. Switzerland is kind of the birthplace of Anabaptism. So, and even started writing prophetic books, and he envisioned that after the apocalypse there would be another kind of utopian life of humans when Christ's kingdom comes down to earth, and the Antichrist would be defeated. A lot of very fascinating mystical works. So he died in Salzburg. That's when he was writing this stuff, 1546. Much younger than Galen, mind you, say his detractors, of course. But let's get to his ideas, because his biography, is fascinating as it is, I haven't really told you what he accomplished, really. So the majority of Paracelsus's works were published after his death, so he never saw any fame. Despite all the publicity, his following really happens long after he dies. Late 16th, mostly in the 17th century. Actually, 100 years after he's dead is when he gets serious followers. And the idea that really stuck, we'll see, is not really the mystical part of Paracelsus's thought. It's the idea that chemicals can heal. So he ends up founding an entirely new school, a new way of thinking about medicine. When was the last time we had a new way of thinking that was non-humoral? It's been a long, long time, okay? They're called Paracelsians sometimes simply, but let's use the technical term for them. They are iatrochemists, okay? Iatro meaning, iatrea means medicine, iatros is a healer, like pediatrics, right? Or geriatrics. So iatrochemistry or iatrochemical means healing with chemicals, which we have not seen, right? A few minerals were used, ammonium salts, things like that, but he's actually going to use the tools of alchemy, distillation, precipitation, condensation, all these different things, and invent chemical drugs that are going to be used in medicine, okay? That's his most important achievement, okay? Dumping Galen, I would say, and the humoral system, that's his greatest impact upon history, and he dumps Galen lock, stock, and barrel. So unlike the botanists, unlike Vesalius, who we saw, he gets rid of the whole thing, and he suggests an entirely different system. The first new system since antiquity, I should answer, at least in the West. And it sparks a long series of battles between the Galenists and the Paracelsians. It replaces the argument we talked about a while back about the between the Arabists and the Hellenists, right? The Galenic revival people and the old people who are still believing in Avicenna. That disappears, and the new argument from about 1560 to about 1660 is between the chemists and the humouralists, okay, or the Paracelsians and the Galenists. Becomes this enormous argument. And once again, why is this exciting to us? It's controversy, it's argument, it's innovation. right? It's competition. You don't like your humoralist doctor, you can go to a Galenist and he'll sell you something cheap, made in his laboratory. Okay. Um, Now, why this is so important also is Paracelsus introduced a new elemental theory. Okay, it's one not based on the four Empedoclean elements, not based on humors, but based on chemicals as the fundamental regulating substance in the body and the fundamental structure of the universe, which of course is true, right? When we think of elements today, we think of oxygen, helium. They're chemicals, right? Um, Now, I don't want to call him a chemist because he's essentially an alchemist, meaning there's still a lot of mystical stuff here, but he is suggesting, incorrectly, of course, that there are three fundamental elements that are the building blocks of the universe. They are sulfur, mercury, and salt. Various different kinds of sulfurs, mercuries, and salts, but those are the three basic structures. Um, they are strangely not mass of matter that gets put together to form, of course, not atoms. They don't have that idea at all. But strangely, they're kind of transformative processes in a way that looks a lot like the Chinese idea of elements. That's a coincidence, okay? That's got to be a coincidence. But the idea is that sulfur is the principle in nature which is all combustibility, all flammability, as an agent of change. When things change, it's because they burn. It's the principle of sulfur. Okay, sulfur does burn. Incidentally, gunpowder is made of sulfur, carbon, and saltpeter. But you didn't know that, right? I shouldn't have told you. Anyway, the second element, mercury, is the volatile principle. So anything that's spirituous, smoky, anything that moves, rises, flows around, that's the principle of mercury. You can see how similar it is to the Chinese system. It's weird. And then salt is the solid principle. It's actually similar to Ayurveda too. Now that I'm thinking about it, right? That's Vata, Pitta is movement, right? So mercury is like that. And there's three doshas. There's three elements here. That's weird. Okay. The salt is the solid principle. Everything that's the building blocks that puts things together. Okay. Now, what these three elements describe is all alchemical changes in nature, all transformations, all things that are broken down into their essences. And I'm using that term alchemical, not chemistry yet, because there's a lot of stuff that's missing. Okay, quantification and a lot of instruments are missing. But in any case, let's just call it alchemy because that's what it is. There's also something vaguely spiritual about this in a weird way, meaning that matter doesn't disappear in his system. It's all just sort of transformed by natural processes without being broken down, without being destroyed. It's just matter is changed and reintegrated into other compounds, or it's put into other creatures. And that, of course, that's true, right? I mean, your chemicals don't disappear. If anything, your soul disappears after you're dead. Your character, your personality, who you are, is gone. Your matter gets recycled, goes into the soil, it gets sucked up by trees, and animals eat the trees, we eat the animals. It's kind of a circle of circle of life. I won't start singing, but you get where I'm going. But here, the way Paracelsus describes this, he says, well, wood, when it burns, that's the sulfurous principle in the flame. The smoke that rises is the mercurial principle. And the ash left over, the salty, solid part, that's the part that goes back into the earth and gets reused. So these are just transformations of matter, and the parts get separated when you burn a piece of wood, but they're not destroyed. Not really destroyed, which I think is really kind of amazing. So the alchemist's job is basically, remember this point, this is the central point, just speeding up those processes that would happen in nature anyway. Using the natural forces of nature replicated in a laboratory to reduce plants and minerals into their constituent essences by means of burning or distillation or precipitation or evaporation. Right? You have a liquid, you can evaporate it, and you have chemical left over. And all these sort of laboratory procedures, which are invented by alchemists for partly medical reasons, partly for making alcohol. That's what distillation is for, right? Partly for spiritual purposes. A whole side of alchemy is this fascinating mystical process that has nothing, doesn't look anything like modern chemistry. We tend to think that they're primarily interested in transmuting lead into gold. That's not true. Although that always struck me as a really sensible thing to do. I don't know, because if you look at the periodic table of elements, all you've got to do is like flick off one of those protons, and you're changing the gold into lead into gold, aren't you? I mean, I don't know why we don't do that. I guess maybe it's impossible. But in any case, that's not really what they're doing. Much of alchemy is actually a spiritual practice. So, how do these substances work now that you've reduced plants and minerals down to their chemical essences? How does the pharmacy actually work? It's not through visible, perceptible qualities, things that you can test or see or smell or taste, and certainly not hot or cold qualities, nothing like that. But rather, there are internal, invisible virtues that your senses cannot perceive, right? Don't look, smell, taste, or listen. They are fifth essences, invisible forces that link these earthly materials to astral forces by means of correspondence or sympathy. So when you take a drug, it's the power of the sun that's being harnessed that's causing you to be suddenly healthy or to ruin a disease. In other words, the plant or chemical that you're making out of this plant is sympathetically linked to a star or a divine power or something we cannot see, an occult force, right? Something that's invisible, or an occult property, right? It's not. This is why this is not modern science we're talking about. Okay, it's not measuring things objectively. You're finding out spiritually what these substances do, and the forces in nature, unseen forces that they will draw in because of their chemical nature. Okay? Chemistry is really mystical to start with. I know, weird. And how do you find out the properties of these chemicals? By reading the book of nature. You observe, but you have to go way beyond that. You don't have a theory and then you're deducing the properties of stuff, like you would say, oh, this tomato is cold and moist because it's phlegmatic and it's watery and it's going to cause cold. That's a deduction. This is you'd have to sort of carefully look at the tomato and try and figure out what kind of correspondence it has to find out its powers through mystical apprehension. You look at signs, things that are going to be clues to what it is. And here we return, of course, to the doctrine of signatures. The tomato is red. It must have the power of Mars, a red planet. It must be, a brave, warlike vegetable. I don't know. I'm making this shit up. But the power is in the star, not in the chemical or the object itself. Okay. Let me give you an example of Paracelsus's signatures. An orchid root comes in two little round things that hang at the bottom of the orchid. He said, look like testicles. They're good for curing them. Euphrasia has black spots on it. Look like two eyes. It's good for your eyes. Walnuts. I don't think Paracelsus actually said this because I've looked for it. I think it's Oswald Kroll, who's an alchemist. But he says walnuts look like brains. They're good for your brain. So you can see this is that old doctrine of signatures come back. The research is not scientific at all. It's mystical. And I'm being obviously a little facetious here, but I want you to see this is a very different epistemology. You know the truth by observation, by experience, but the logic of what things are good for is mystical. It's these signs, the color, the shape, the form of something is giving you a hint of what it's going to be good for. It's certainly not a clinical trial, and it's not a deduction like Aristotelian logic would be, but it's a mystical apprehension of the powers that are laden in the chemical and the forces that it can draw out of the universe. Okay, so it sounds like nonsense, doesn't it? But in truth, Paracelsus discovered chemical remedies. He found things that worked very quickly, sometimes violently, some things that were purgative. Um, I mean, he didn't discover mercury for syphilis, but that's one of the chemicals that they start using at this point. And people believe in them because they're relatively cheap. They have immediate dramatic effects. They're not like the galenical compounds that have a million expensive herbs and spices in them. And they seem to be far more effective. In fact, let me give you another word here. The word is spagirical. If you ever want to really impress people with your arcane knowledge, spagirical means to is that backwards? I don't know. It means to separate things. Actually, I'll write it backwards then. You didn't think I could do this, huh? Hang on. Jericho. Did that work? Yeah. Okay, so I don't know which one was backwards or not, but in any case, spagirical. It seems like I'm doing mystical things here, aren't I? It means to separate pure from impure. So that's how you start with plants or minerals, whatever, and the chemical processes make these very concentrated chemical pills, things. Well, not pills, but you know what I mean. Things you can pop. Gains an enormous following in the next century. Everyone, especially rulers, get really, really turned on to this idea. Sometimes physicians will use them right next to the old medicines. They could just get plopped into the whole pharmacopoeia, right? Another thing to mention, I mentioned astrology, and I want to mention that it's a little different than deterministic astrology, which means that your astrological sign is written in the stars and it's your fate. There's nothing you can do to change that. It's a little different than like casting horoscopes. A horoscope will say on this day you will find money or you'll find romance, whatever. That's not what Paracelsus is doing. He's basically saying that the stars influence physical matter directly because of this link between microcosm and macrocosm, and that and this is obvious. There's things we know. The tides are affected by the moon. Your body is affected by phases of the moon. More babies are born during a full moon. Plants will grow differently. I mean, things like that. Of course, it's atmospheric pressure we now know, but he's saying, of course, plants affect the planets affect things here on Earth. And the whole universe in his mind is like this big electrically charged circuit board, where something up here happens and then it affects things down here. But the planets don't make you do stuff. They just sort of incline you to change your body chemistry and then incline you to be angry one day or to be happy, whatever it may be. So it's not deterministic astrology, you know what I mean by that? It's just like, here's just the influence of stars on you. So again, you got to know what substances are linked to what star, so then you know how they're going to affect your body. Let me mention a couple of other things that may seem a little arcane, but they're really very important in what separates this medical system from the humoral system, and a couple of key features. One thing, maybe the most important, is that it is not allopathic. You don't cure with opposites. You cure like substances with like. Paracelsian medicine is homeopathic. Okay? That means that a little tiny particle of a substance that's similar to your ailment will complete the circuit, will link to astral forces. So it doesn't have to be a big dose. It can be a tiny little drop of a chemical, which is probably a good idea so it doesn't kill you, right, if you're taking mercury or something like that. But let's imagine, I don't know, you have a patient who's suffering from jaundice. They need something that is going to harness the power of an astral force that's good for jaundice. And God has left us these little clues, remember? Paracelsus thought every single sickness has a cure. We just have to go find it. You have to have the patience to figure it out. And in fact, Paracelsus, remember, traveled around looking for this stuff. Think of how different that is from Hippocrates for a moment. Hippocrates sat there and watched the patient die and described it and said, "There's nothing I can do really, but I'll describe this." Paracelsus is not. He's going out and he's looking for stuff and finding new medicines and trying them. Anyway, back to jaundice, right? So jaundice is makes your eyes turn yellow, you will need something similar, a yellow plant. I'm literally making this up. Let's imagine a marigold or a yellow chemical like sulfur. A distillate of sulfur might work. Because it's similar to it, God's going to give you a hint of what that's for. The color will tell you, and then you give that to the patient, and the jaundice will disappear. Okay? So, again, along with homeopathic cures, another interesting idea here is that, and this is totally distinguished from Galenic medicine, is that all diseases have specific external causes. They're not the result of imbalances in your body or the result of your dietary habits or something. They're things that come from the outside and invade you. They're entities in their own right. They're not exactly. This is not an idea of contagion, okay? I don't want you to think that. It's not like one person has something, a germ, coughs, and another person gets it. That's the idea of Fracastoro. Do you remember him a few weeks back? Fracastoro thought diseases are like seeds. They go into you, they replicate, and then you get really sick, which is true, okay? What he thought is that the essences of the disease come from the outside, but they're not material things. They're spiritual things that will invade your body and cause disrupt your natural functions. And they're only restored by using other good spiritual forces that are similar, strangely, not things that are opposite. They're not, how should I put this? They're not physical entities like germs that you want to flush out of your system either. They're spiritual, malign forces that have to be corrected with good forces from the outside. The other very interesting thing is Paracelsus believed that individual organs or parts of the body could be affected without the rest of the body being thrown off. Remember before we had the whole psychosomatic body, your mind goes off, your body will go off. You can't have just one part that's sick. In Paracelsus you can. This is not a holistic system in that respect. You can have a specific localized disease. You can get a disease just in your elbow or just in your kidney or just in that respect it's a much closer to modern medicine. In fact, you can have a completely healthy body and just a sick liver, right? Paracelsus agrees with that. I mean, that's an idea of his. And usually it's an individual organ. In Paracelsus's system, it begins to malfunction, and then it doesn't properly process materials. It doesn't break them down efficiently. It doesn't transform them through these chemical processes. And in fact, I should mention this very importantly. Put a big star next to this. The things that happen in your body are the same as those that happen in the lab, in your alchemical instruments. There's a kind of combustion in your body, which is true. That's what breathing is, right? Exchange of oxygen. There's a kind of distillation. There's a kind of precipitation. All that stuff happens, and your body is a big refiner. It takes your food and it transforms it into chemicals. These are all chemical processes going on in your body. And I should mention something very important here. I don't want to jump the gun, but let me just mention that a follower of Paracelsus, this is Johannes Jan Baptista van Helmont in the 17th century, says, well, if the whole body is just chemical processes, what's really going on in digestion? It's acid breaking down the proteins, causing the the chemical constituents of the food to be broken up so our body can use it. And we know that's true, right? It seems counterintuitive because we know that digestion can't be heat. There's no flame inside. But in their minds, to the Galenists' minds, having acid in your stomach was just as illogical. It would burn a hole through you, right? It isn't, but it is in fact, of course, hydrochloric acid, right? In any case, we'll come back to Van Helmont down the road. But the point is that sickness is caused by a chemical function going all awry in the body, and when that happens, it creates these deposits in parts of your body that he called tartar. Now, where he gets this word is very, very interesting. Tartars, originally, tartaric acid, in fact, is when you make wine, these little crystals will form and drop to the bottom of the barrel, and when you decant it, you make sure that those don't get in there. But sometimes it's on the side of the barrel also, and those are actually crushed up their cream of tartar. If you buy that to keep your egg whites stiff, for example, it's something you can buy in any grocery store, but it comes from winemaking. And Paracelsus thought, oh, well, your whole body is doing things very much like fermentation in wine. Okay, they don't know why that's happening yet, how that happens, but it does actually refine it. And in fact, a follower of Paracelsus down the road wrote a whole book on fermentation, which I adore. I've actually written about it. But in any case, when something goes wrong, your body deposits these substances, these tartrates, calcified solids that will fill up your arterial walls. They will be on your teeth if you don't brush them. We still call that tartar, right? Tartar buildup. And they will deposit in your muscles when you get gout, a kind of tartrate, or essentially they're the impure constituents of matter that's not properly refined and separated from the body. And note, they're not the cause of disease. This is the side effect of an organ malfunctioning. That's why the tartrates build up. And the most common form, and in fact, this system explains so much that Galen couldn't. The most common form of these are kidney stones and bladder stones, right? They were called gravel at that time, but it's a calcium deposit that forms in your bladder, in your kidneys, that's caused by faulty digestion. And what is amazing is that Paracelsus, against the common wisdom that sugar is really good for you, he said it's really difficult to process sugar. It burns up in your body like it does if you heat sugar in a pan, right? It turns to caramel and then it burns. He said that this is sweets are really very dangerous for the digestion. Let me read this to you. I hope I can translate it. Und Zucker, Honig geben will Tartara, wo sie in solche Digesten kommen und die Sauer wie gemelt ist. Sugar and honey become so much tartar that in the process of digestion, when they mix with the acid, they're mixed. They will create these tartars. Okay, so you see, that's prescient, isn't it? And other diseases too. Tartar builds up in the lung. It causes what the Greeks called phthisis. We now call it tuberculosis. That's what causes coughing. It causes asthma. Tartar builds up in your brain. It causes insomnia first, and then later strokes or insanity. That's a physical manifestation of these chemical deposits in your brain. At any rate, the point I'm making is that tartar is a major source of illness in Paracelsus's whole pathology. Now let me go back over these and enumerate these features. Things that distinguish them from humoral medicine. Disease is a concrete entity that can be felt, not an imbalance. Disease is exogenous, means it comes from the outside, or from unprocessed or undigested matter that's in the food. It's not endogenous, it's not in the person itself. Disease can be defined in chemical terms, right? Your alchemical processes are not going correctly. The process is specific, right? It can be just one part of your body, not your whole body, and it's local. That doesn't mean it can't spread to the rest of your body, but it will have one origin specific to a place in your body. And then what am I up to? 6 is diseases can be seen and investigated in the body, and the causes can be searched for. Now, having said that, Paracelsus was not into anatomy. He thought cutting up a dead body tells you absolutely nothing about what's going on in living beings, but you can examine a living person. You can actually look carefully. Something not really, I don't know. I mean, a physician always looks, but this is a different kind of very close scrutiny, investigation, looking at nature directly without authorities as intermediaries, basically. Now, what does he discover? I know I've been talking about theory and I'm going all the way around it and around it. Well, he actually introduced a lot of pharmaceutical products to the Materia Medica. I think the most important of these is a tincture of opium, meaning it's alcohol with opiates mixed in, which is called laudanum. Okay, you've probably heard of this. Laudare in Latin means to praise, but it's praiseworthy. But laudanum is used right up well into the 20th century, and it's still around. It's not quite as strong as other opiates like heroin and things that were invented originally for medicine, of course, but it's just about the strongest drug that they would have had in the 16th century is laudanum. It is a real painkiller. Okay, um, doesn't cure you, but it works very well. Not quite as well as morphine. Morphine is a little stronger, and of course heroin and other opiates. But he made stuff using mercury, lead, arsenic, iron, copper sulfate, all sorts of tinctures and elixirs, and these things all probably had some very visible effects. So this kind of curing becomes very popular, especially among poor people who can't afford exotic spices and all these and interestingly, princes get really interested in it. The other thing that is credited to him as a discovery is it's claimed he was trying to extract a vitriol of sulfur, and discovered ether. He discovered, which makes chickens fall asleep. So I don't know whether that's true, but he's obviously doing a kind of experimentation, right? Mixing chemicals, seeing what they're like. The ether doesn't really get discovered until the 19th century, but he's making things that are similar, and his followers definitely will be doing chemicals, pharmacy. So let's go to those people. Paracelsus died at age 48. His enemies said after drunken binge, who knows or cares. But his works are really published after he dies. And his theories, immediately after he dies, actually caused a lot of controversy. One was over the use of antimony, which the Galenists said is a poison. The Paracelsians said, yes, of course it's a poison. If you give it an enormous dose, if you give the tiniest dose, it will work for similar diseases, right? So a couple of books come out later in the century supporting Paracelsus. He has many followers in England. And by the 1570s or so, Paracelsianism becomes popular at European courts. All the mysticism is stripped away, and the chemical remedies remain. The Paracelsians get some very powerful protectors. The Elector of the Palatinate, Otto Heinrich, was a collector of Paracelsian manuscripts. He hired a Paracelsian named Adam von Bodenstein. And I mentioned Bodenstein because he's a radical reformer also. He's a follower of Andreas Karlstadt. So all these people, many of these people were also mystics. The Landgrave Moritz of Hesse dabbled in chemical experiments himself. He hired Johannes Hartmann as court physician. They set up a Collegium Chemicum in Marburg in 1609. That's a chemical college. That's what it means. The King of Denmark got a Paracelsian physician. But the most important person, and maybe remember him, is the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II hired alchemists and astronomers and magicians to come to his court in Prague in the 17th century. Among these people are Tycho Brahe, who was an astronomer. Notice I'm using a different word here, not astrologer, an astronomer, and who made incredibly accurate astronomical observations at his little observatory. And then Johannes Kepler, the discoverer of the laws of planetary motion, is at the same place at the same time. But in any case, Rudolf hired and brought to Prague his own Paracelsian physicians, the most interesting of which is Oswald Kroll, Kroll, who wrote the Basilica Chymica, a chemistry text that is remarkable. So there are Paracelsians in lots of very high places, forming royal academies, and notice, separate from universities. These are sponsored by the king. And especially, notice also, these are Protestant countries where this happens. So there is a definite connection to religion. But in fact, some Catholic countries get them too. I'm thinking of a guy who was physician to Henry IV of France, wrote an introduction to Paracelsian medicine. This is Joseph Duchesne. I know him because he's also wrote a dietary. And really interesting because he's the first person who said, Galenism and Paracelsianism are not mutually antagonistic. We can have both. We can keep the humors and use chemical medicines. Really, really fascinating figure. One of my favorite authors. And a very great promoter of eau de vie brûlante as a distiller, preserver of life. He's talking about alcohol. So that's another reason he interests me, I guess. But I should mention, these people who pass on Paracelsian medicine really take out the mystical parts. They take out sort of the angry vitriolic parts of Paracelsus, and I think that, and all the incomprehensible stuff is stripped from there. So chemical medicine gets a kind of legitimacy, even if Paracelsus himself didn't. And several official pharmacopoeias, list of medicines. The Pharmacopoeia Londinensis of 1618 includes these chemical remedies. So they become legitimate, very interestingly. And in the long run, of course, the synthesis of Galenism and Paracelsianism doesn't work, but ultimately the humorism loses its credit because those medicines don't really effectively do anything, right? Cinnamon, it's lovely, but it's not going to cure you, right? And it's partially also because the Paracelsianism had a very popular appeal, right? That for ordinary poor people who don't have a lot of money, this is a kind of charity. And we'll see that this is a kind of medicine that really caught on among people who will be called Puritans, people who in England, and then where you associate that word is with the Massachusetts Bay Colony, right? John Winthrop, the first governor of Massachusetts, had a library of Paracelsian medicine. You know where it is now? It's in Harvard. You can go there and read them. But that's the connection to religion I've been belaboring and trying to get you to understand. And I would say, the whole idea of using chemical medicines as a kind of charity, that's kind of indicative of Nicholas Culpeper, wrote an herbal following John Gerard. He's another one of those herbalists, but fought on the side of Parliament, was a Puritan, believed in these in astrology and chemical medicine and stuff like that. So let me conclude just by mentioning a figure who I have brought up. But this is Jan Baptista van Helmont, 1579 to 1644, Flemish. He's the bridge between the Paracelsian mysticism and the real scientific revolution. And I want to mention him here as a follower of Paracelsus because he's the first person to kind of apply scientific method to these ideas, run chemical tests, do quantification, keep detailed records, and run real experiments. Okay, so this is where the, how should I say, the step over. And he's the one, of course, who I mentioned just before, thinking of digestion as acids breaking down and enzymes breaking down food in the stomach chemically. I also want to mention him because he gets really into this idea of fermentation as something that's happening in your body, which we're only figuring out right now is true. Okay, there are microbes and bacteria that ferment stuff inside your body that are essential to your health, not just your digestion, your lymph function, your brain functions, but fermentation becomes the hot new thing among Paracelsian chemists, and I will come back to it when we talk about Thomas Willis and people like that. But in any case, Van Helmont invented the word gas, which is kind of amazing, as a form of chemical, not just spirits, not just matter that's heated like water and turns into vapor. He said that the gases are central to life, and that there are different gases. He doesn't know oxygen yet, but he's surmising, not like the ancient pneuma, there's this weird life force that comes through the air and goes into your mouth. He's saying it's a gas that comes in and is some kind of exchange is happening in your bloodstream, that is a chemical exchange, which is, of course, right. That there's a chemical that regulates your metabolism, which is, of course, glucose. He's right. That there are different kinds of gas. There's Sylvester gas. There's actually, he does discover carbon dioxide in 1641. He says that the stuff that's going in your mouth is not the same as what's going out. It's a chemical change. Of course, it's oxygen and lots of other stuff, but it's carbon dioxide that's going out. that is a product of a kind of fermentation, he thinks, but really interesting. And a person who ran lots of experiments. So I just want to bring that up, and we'll come back to him as the link between Mr. Paracelsus, finally showing you a picture of him, sorry, and what will be the scientific revolution, which we'll get to next time. Yeah, well, when I see you again in person. This is the last of our online YouTube lectures.